Okay, everybody, thank you very much for coming today to the museum. I'd like to, in the first place, welcome you to this building. It's one of two convict-built buildings still standing in Brisbane. There's the other one is the windmill, of course. Can you hear all right? Can you hear all right now? Okay, all right. Sorry, well, I'll start all over again. Welcome to the Commissariat Store. That's the home of the Royal Historical Society of Queensland. It's one of two convict-built buildings still in Brisbane. The other is the windmill, of course. And if any of you are interested in joining the Royal Historical Society, I'm sure the staff upstairs will be only too happy to give you a form to fill in and go with that. Every second Wednesday of each month, we have a talk here that's free for all members, of course. And today we have Keith Boulton here from sort of our competition across the river, the Maritime Museum. I've recently been doing some research on South Brisbane's history, the city of South Brisbane history, and it amazed me just how important the maritime with the dry dock was. Not so much in terms of employment, but more training. And it was a major turning out place for people training to be apprentice plumber, metal worker, later on electrician, the whole thing. It was very, very crucial to the education of that educated working class. So Keith has a long experience. I've got his thing there. He's done just about every job in the world. I assumed he would have been a sailor or in the Marines or something, but no, he's not. But he did have a connection with the gravel dredges we all hated on the Brisbane some years ago. Keith is a long-time member of the Maritime Museum. He's a very good speaker. He's going to talk today about the history of the dry dock or the graving dock. And then, of course, it doesn't operate anymore, but now the Maritime Museum is now going very well. So if you have an urgent question, let's jump up. But otherwise, please wait to the end. We'll have questions and answers at the end. Thank you very much. Over to you, Keith.
Bill. Now, can you all hear me at the back? Good. Turn up a bit, yeah. How's that? Is that better? Righto. Well, thanks, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Bill, for the introduction. Now, today we're going to talk about the Maritime Museum and the South Brisbane Dry Docks. So the program will be the history between 1859 and 1972, and then from 1972 to 2002, the history of the Queensland Maritime Museum. And also an insight about the Queensland Maritime Museum today. I'm sure you're all interested to find out how we're operating and how we're going. So the South Brisbane Dry Dock started in 1887. So that's what it looked like if you were around that time. Hands up those who were born in 1887. Nobody here today? Oh, what a shame. So that's what it looked like. You'll notice that the dry dock at that stage had no cranes, no buildings at all. It was just basically a hole in the ground for the ships to be repaired. And in the distance you can see Parliament House. And if you weren't too sure where the South Brisbane Dry Dock is, that's a map of 1900. Right in the bend, the deepest part of the river in those days, and no bridges. So we'll talk about now the need for the dry dock, the construction, the infrastructure to keep it going, the operations, World War II, and the closure. So the need. All reminded that in 1859, Queen Victoria signed Letters Patent to form the colony of Queensland. So we finally broke away from New South Wales and got to wear red jerseys. Yay! In 1859, June the 6th is recognised as Queensland Day. And December the 10th, Queensland was formally separated from New South Wales. They all wore black armbands after that. At that period, shipping was the only method of supply to the other coastal towns in the colony of Queensland. The new colony implemented the formation of a government shipping vessels plus a dredging fleet to keep the ports open. Very important. The early ship repairs were carried out on their river beaches and very small slipways situated at Lytton and Queensport as well as the river at Kangaroo Point underneath the Story Bridge. There were no convenient facilities for servicing large vessels at the Port of Brisbane until the South Brisbane Dry Dock was opened in 1881. The dry dock was the first dry dock built in Queensland, and with its opening, the South Brisbane Dry Dock was pivotal in the development of the state of Queensland, thus allowing maintenance of the dredging fleet. Construction. In 1874, the land was resumed at a cost of £25,000. In 1875, the plans were laid to dry dock by William Nesbitt. In 1875, 289 vessels arrived in the river port at the same time the construction was started. And that's what the construction looked like in those days. So it was a series of piles in the middle of the dry dock, held up by support, so it was all dredged by hand. And when you think back in those days, there was no computerised digital readings, no slide rules, just pencil and paper, and probably a plumb bob and a theodolite to build a dry dock. Fantastic exercise. In 1881, the dry dock was finally opened the 10th of September. In 1884, they already found that the ships are getting bigger, so they need to extend it. And the total cost of the whole exercise was £83,000 or $167,000. And the contractor was J.A. Oberon, and the dimensions of the dock was 131 metres, 1.4 and 2.4 at the coping, and a depth of 10 metres. The stonework consists of Brisbane pink porphyry from the Kangaroo Point quarry, which was very convenient because they had a rower line that went from the quarry to the dry dock to carry the stone to the dry dock. And on the dock floor, held in sandstone and granite throughout. And that's the picture of the rower line from the dry dock to the quarry. A lot of this has been forgotten in our history. Surprising when we dug it up to find out that was how they brought the stone in. Plus Melbourne granite from the Lockyer Creek freestone, coping and facing on the steps. And hardwood inserts on the dock floor. And they are still there to this day. They were needed to hold the props to hold the ship up, nailed in place, and then taken away when the ship floated away. And recesses in the dock walls to slide the material up and down using horses, because there was no crane. So the only way to get stuff from the bottom of the dock to the top of the dock is to slide up these slides tied to a horse. Fascinating to think how they did it. So in the construction, 250 men were employed. The project took longer than anticipated. A second coffer dam had to be built at the entrance after the first one collapsed. Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about a coffer dam, we're talking about a temporary structure like a wall put in the river to keep the water out. They drive the poles in, put the planks on it, nail it in place. And the first one collapsed and flooded the dock, so they pump it out and do it started again. 48,000 cubic metres of rock had to be excavated by manpower, carted away by horse and cart, which is another remarkable feat. And fill was used the low-lying and the swampy area near the present-day South Bank Conference Complex. So next time you go to the complex, just think that you're standing on land from the dry dock. Infrastructure, the caisson. Now the caisson is like a big floating bathtub. I think that's the best way I can describe it. The design caisson was built in situ in the dock in 1880 by Smelly and Company in Brisbane. Smelly and Company actually had a foundry, would you believe, in Ann Street in the city. So they were able to cast all the segments, bring it to the dry dock with horse and dray, put in the dry dock and then assemble it by hand using rivets. The caisson became an important tool of the dock's operation. It could float, it was built like a ship and even had iron ballast. It operated the river entrance to the dock, opening up like a gate for ships to enter and sealing the dock when the dock was open. I guess the easiest way to describe the dry dock's operation is that the first thing you need to know when the ship's coming is you need to have the plans of the ship, because the dockmaster needs to put the blocks in place to support the ship so it doesn't bend when it's sitting on the ground. So once you got that in place, then they'd open up the sluice gates, so when the tide come in, the dock slowly filled with water. And when it was high water, then they floated the caisson out of the way, brought the ship in, put the casing back in place and then pump the water out again so the ship was sitting upright. And that's how it worked. The case remained in service at the Queensland Maritime Museum until 1998 when it failed and allowed the water to flood into the dock. So to support the dock you needed some steam. So 3 Cornish boilers were purchased from Easton and Anderson of London. The coal-fired boilers were replaced with similar Cornish boilers by Evan, Anderson and Phelan, who were underneath the Story Bridge and still in place today. That's what they look like. During World War II, the brick boiler and pump house was enclosed in concrete as a concrete blockhouse to provide any bombing protection. This is the instigation of the American Armed Forces. And public concerns about the complaint about coal smoke continued for 40 years. Surprise, surprise. Now the big pumps, 2 centrifugal pumps for emptying the dock were imported from London. The dock were flooded by opening the sluice gates of the river, and it took 4 hours to pump the dock dry. That's a photo of the pumps. In 1924, the steam engines were replaced by electric motors constructed by Evans Deakin of Brisbane. Once electric power was used, the boiler was maintained to provide power for the machine shop to run their belts on their lathes. Coal supply, a critical part of the dry docks operation. Coal was the boiler fuel and supplied by Queensland Government rail system to the dry dock from the Ipswich coal mines. By 1884, the rail line provided access to the river for future coal shipments from the West Melton collieries. In 1885, the coal wharves were built by Greg Sprite and Company of Brisbane, and that's what the coal wharves looked like in those days. Don't you love the hat? And the rail line extension through the dry dock was opened, and that's what the coal wharf looked like when they're loading up there. The export trade for the coal wasn't a big success as far as Queensland was concerned. About 1900, I think their maximum export was about 837,000 tonnes, compared to Newcastle, 1,200,000 tonnes. And that was what the railway system looked like when it was in place. Lots of sidings, and the railway tunnel went underneath the Vulture Street roadway, connected to Wollongabba, and then on through to Park Road. Who can remember the railway line, the train going through Wollongabba, the man running in front with the bell? A big scary thing, wasn't it? So that's how the coal was delivered to the dry dock. And when the council did some excavation work in 2019, lo and behold, they dug up some of the original railway spikes. So they were able to pass this on to the museum. So the railway system, in 1884, a Stanley Street station was opened beside the dry dock. And the station operations were very restrictive. It closed on the 21st of December 1981 when Wilton Street extension was opened. The reason why it was so restrictive, as you can appreciate, a train with carriages on would pull into the blind siding at where the dry dock is. The passengers would alight. Then another train would come in the other end, pull the carriages out of the way, and then the loco would reverse all the way back to Wollongabba, through the tunnel, put on the turntable, turn around and reverse all the way back again to hook up the carriages again. So they can only do 3 movements a day. And if you're a lady going to town to do shopping in those days, you'd alight at South Brisbane Station, then you had a choice of either walking up to Stanley Street to get the horse-drawn tram into Queen Street, or walking down to Tribune Street and getting a steam-powered ferry across the river. Not a very fun exercise for ladies, I might add. And when the station closed, the dock siding was open for traffic. And that's what the siding looked like in those days. And the rail line was extended all the way through the dock to the Victoria Bridge. Because in those days, now near the Victoria Bridge was Red Bank Meat Works, the fish board, and the 2 flour mills that depended on not only coal for their furnaces, but also the wheat to convert into flour. And the line closed in 1969. When I worked in South Brisbane, we always had a fear that the water rats were that big that they could push a load of wagon of wheat down the line to eat it. Well, we never proved that, just our theory. So in 1881 to 1889, the first vessel was the bark, the Doom, and then followed, and we had limited workshop facilities. For the early vessels with a rounded hull, the timber beams were required to support the sides to keep the vessel upright. In 1885, the SS Leichhardt was in dry dock. In later years, the iron and steel vessels had a flat bottom and supports were no longer needed. And as the water was pumped out, so the cleaning down of the hull commenced using large barges. So the painters and dockers were pretty smart blokes. They decided if they put a punt beside the ship, and as the water was pumped out, it was slowly went down, give them a chance to scrape all the barnacles off the ship, which made the painting easy to do when they got down the bottom. In 1902, the Department of Harbours and Marine was created, and in 1907, the steam dredge platypus was repaired. Electric lighting was installed. In 1910, our Queensland Navy original, HMAS Guyanda, was overhauled, and that's another story. In 1815, the dock casing was overhauled at Peter Slip at Kangaroo Point. From 1818 to 1927, in these years, the dock was used very well for swimming carnivals. Ladies, you'll love the costumes. Imagine going swimming in those today. So it was a cheap alternative for a swimming bath. I filled up with water, invited all the kids in and had a good time. In 1921, the last repairs of the Lucinda took place. That was the government yacht. And typical 1923 was typical dry ship docking. In 1924, even then, calls were made for a larger Brisbane dry dock. The ships were still getting bigger and bigger. In 1924, the rail line to Cairns opened and the coastal shipping declined. Before that time, the only way to get to Cairns from towns like Rockhampton was by ship. The roads weren't in place and riding a horse was not a desired thing, so really the 1924 was the crux for the shipping industry in Queensland. In 1938 saw the conversion of ex-suction dredge, the Hercules, to a bucket dredge for Queensland Cement Line. And this was to dredge the coral out of Mud Island to make cement. In 1939, the dry dock becomes a prohibited defence area, and between 40 and 41, only 32 ships entered the dock. World War II. In 1942, the American Navy's third submarine facility was established in Brisbane. Between 43 onwards, 38 vessels were docked, including 28 US Navy submarines, and the outside contractors used were Evans Deacon and Sargents. In 1943, in February, a major work was completed, including the replacement of a new bow on the HMS USN submarine Growler. And that's what it looked like. Came into port, had a run-in with a Japanese cruiser, bent the nose, and then the Americans were deciding to take it back to the States to fix it, and the Aussie said, no, you don't, we can do it. So Evans Deacon created a new bow, welded in place, and also they welded on it a steel kangaroo. And it became known as the Kangaroo Express. And that's it being welded in place. So the operator in those days operated for 24 hours. And that's a photo of the submarine actually in the dry dock. The federal government provides funding for a new fitting out wharf and workshop. In 1945, the new river-class frigate, HMAS Diamond Tenor, built in Maryborough by Walkers, was in dock for installation of the Aztec cone. And that's what the Aztec cone looked like, for finding the submarines, like an underwater radar, sends out a beam. At the end of World War II, the South Brisbane dry dock had serviced 153 warships from 4 Allied navies. This included the 85 naval submarines over a period of 3 years. From 1944 on, the larger Transcross graving dock opened, and the South Brisbane dry dock and Brisbane City wharves generally became redundant. It's sad to report to this day that the Transcross dock is no longer in operation, and they're still working out what's going to happen down there. The gate's been taken off and the dock is flooded. In 1946, the South Brisbane dry dock was handed back to the Queensland government, and heavy losses began with a drop in dock entries. And like most governments, they don't like to lose money. In 1946, the Coal Wharf complex had been dismantled and removed. In 1958, the small coast vessels, the Melbourne, was in the dock. And the ship entry was restricted now by the new Captain Cook Bridge. With the closure of the line in 1969, all rail equipment was removed, making way for the Captain Cook Bridge. And that's what the construction looked like for the Captain Cook Bridge at the early start of it. And ships could no longer in the dock. Finally, the closure in 1972, and not a Queensland government financial asset. The last vessels to dock were the Cementco, followed by the Queensland Harbours and Marine Dredges. Cementco was the vessel used to carry the coral from Mud Island up to Oxley. And that's her in dock at Christmas time. At a total of 5,007 vessels entered the dock during its 91 years. The dry dock was finally closed and left flooded. And the final transfer to Queensland Maritime Association was on February 25th, September 1972. So at the closure, the third oldest dock in Australia, Fitzroy Dock in Sydney, the Gravings Dock in Williamstown and Queensland. And the South Brisbane dry dock is still the only dry dock in Australia that the public can visit the dock for. So now we're talking about the Queensland Maritime Museum from 73 to 86. In 1971, we got the Forceful. 10th of June, that was the handover, and begins to develop the site for the museum. And of course, in 74 flood, we had the big flood. Who can remember the 74 flood? Yes, we all remember it in due course, yes. In 1978, it became a National Heritage listed area. And in 1998, it became Queensland Heritage listed. In 1975, dry dock preparation began to start to clean it out, which was a major job for the volunteers. Had to pump the water out first, and then at the bottom of the dock in those times was about a metre of mud. In 1980, we had the official opening by the governor. And in 1980 also, we had the HMS Diamond Tina donated by the federal government. In 1981, April 4, HMS Diamond was finally placed in the dry dock. That's what she looked like when she came in. Getting it up from Sydney was another long story, but basically the volunteers from the Queensland Maritime Museum and the Royal Navy got together and brought it up in 2 days to Brisbane, and it was escorted up the river by the Forceful. In 1984, World Expo 88 in Brisbane was announced, and in 88, the Expo was open. And the Queensland Maritime Museum was not part of the Expo, but visitors were welcome, so they could still go on board. And the steam tug Forceful conducted the weekly river cruises. Did anyone go on the river cruises? Oh, good. I've got fond memories. And that's what the Forceful looked like when she was underway. Carried 100 passengers, and you got a barbecue as well. The monorail also from the Expo went through the dry dock area. And I think from later on it was sold and went down to the Gold Coast to Broadbeach. After Expo, the Pavilion of Promise was donated to the Queensland Maritime Museum. In 1999, the Goodwill Bridge was opened. And then the cofferdam was put in place because the caisson failed. So that's what it looked like. It was quite an exercise to get rid of the old dry dock, the old cofferdam. First of all, they built a gantry over the top of it and put slings on it and then tried to lift it out. But being wrought iron, and 100 years old, the slings just pulled through. So what they decided to do was they'd cut down at low tide the caisson as far as they could go, possibly, on a really low tide. And then on a really high tide in March, they floated the Diamantina out over across the caisson, put the cofferdam in place, pumped the water out, and then demolished the cofferdam. demolished the caisson. And then the work began to replace the concrete blocks, build a frame for the lightship, and then bring them all back in place. And then build a cofferdam again, pump out the water and put in the concrete construction wall which is there today. And that's what it looks like, never to be moved again. It's a unique design because of the state government reckoned it was going to be about $8 million job. And one of our volunteers was a structural engineer, and he designed a plan to fabricate and put it together for about $1 million. So he saved the government a lot of money. The official opening was on the 21st of November 2006 by the then Premier, all recognised. So in the meantime, the museum continued on in 1982 with the building like a penguin arrives via the HMAS Trebrook. And in 2011, we got Jessica Watkins' Pink Lady. In 2009, it was the 30th anniversary. So to mark the anniversary, we asked the government to come down and we fired one of our caisson cannons. Clifton cannons. No one was killed. It was just a big bang. But she thoroughly enjoyed it, and so did we. In 2011, surprise, surprise, the Brisbane River floods. HM team afloats and the lightship sinks. I can safely say, ladies and gentlemen, I've been on Diamantina when she was afloat, but we weren't going anywhere and we didn't have a gangway. What we had to do at the end was when the water dropped down, we had to put 1,000 litres of alum in the water to settle the mud so the Navy guys could go down to check on the blocks underneath. And then we finally pumped the water out and she sat where she was. But the poor old lightship, it was a sad state. It got an airlock, floated and then sank. And then we also had to put in a new dock case floor. And that's what it looked like in 2020. So the dock wall stabilisation was taken by the Brisbane City Council, who owns the property, and we leased the property from the council. So they stabilised the wall for us and put around a new fence. We also got painting done on HMS Diamantina on the quarterdeck. And the work continues. On the 20th of November, we unveiled the memorial plaque on the replica smoking room of the Queensland Government yachts Lucinda by the new governor. Just to jog your memory, Lucinda was a Queensland yacht. It was also critical in the development of the Australian Constitution in 1899. Down at Broken Bay in New South Wales, the parliamentarians sat around and decided what was going to happen, and that's what we've got to this day. We also subleased some area to finance our running, so the image area came in 2021. And 2021 was the 50th anniversary of the Queensland Maritime Museum Association. So the happenings in 22. We had effects of a rain bomb in 2022. So the dock did get water in it, but it didn't flood. So I came up to the bottom of the Diamantina, and luckily we didn't get much damage. And that's what it looked like when the tide was at a high tide. Luckily, the insurance covered most of our damage, which was really fortunate. And that's what it looked like with behind. And again, because we've cut big holes in the lightship, it didn't float. It stayed there. So an insight regarding the Australian Maritime Museum. The Queensland Maritime Museum is the only maritime museum in Australia that is not funded by any government. All the others are either state-funded or federal government. So we depend on donations, grants, etc. to keep us going. And the COVID-19 effect really affected our numbers, and we were flat out keeping it going. And now we're on a 5-day week operating from Wednesday to Sunday. Visitor numbers and school visits were increasing. In September alone, we had 390 students come through the museum over 4 weeks. We had a grant from the Australian National Maritime Museum for new signage, which is quite unique because not only does it give a description and photograph of the item, but it also has a QR code that visitors can look at their phone and pick up to 12 languages translation. The venue hire continues, and the site is used for external entertainment. And we now have a monthly jazz night financed by the Brisbane City Council, pay for the bands. We provide the drinks and the food, and it's free entry. So you're more than welcome to come. In 1923 was Forceful's deconstruction. Everyone talks about the Forceful and how they all loved it, but unfortunately it was loved to death. And we got told by the Queensland Maritime Safety that we weren't allowed to put it back in the water after spending $40,000 painting the hull. And then we had to find out what to have to do with it. We had a couple of offers to put on a land-based installation, but that didn't work out. So finally we had to pay for the deconstruction. I think the original quote was about $850,000. To sink it was more. So finally we settled for another figure, which was a lot lower, and they began the deconstruction. One of the other problems we had with the diamond, with the Forceful, of course, was asbestos. Luckily we were able to get that done at a really cheap rate. So revisiting the program, ladies and gentlemen, we've talked about the history of the dry dock and the history of the Maritime Museum, and an insight into Queensland today. And the information sources for the library, the John Oxley Library, my photos, More Than a Haircut and Show by David Jones and Peter Noonan. And thank you, and thanks for your attention.
That's excellent timing, excellent timing. Now we have time for questions and answers, but can you wait till I get the microphone to you?
You showed slides the boilers, probably my bad hearing or getting old or something. I didn't realise where they were.
They're in the boiler house beside the dock at the museum, the pump house.
Okay.
They're on the first floor, the pump house is on the lower floor, below the river level.
Can you hear them?
No. The pumps are no longer in use, and the boilers are no longer in use. Because of the smoke, and we've got no use for a boiler anymore on the dry dock. So we converted the pumps to electric driven, and that was the end of it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. What's the future of the Maritime Museum? Heard that funding, what's the future?
Well, at the moment, we're pleased to say we're operating successfully. We have no paid staff anymore. It's all run by volunteers. So financially, we're doing pretty well. Now that we've disposed of the Forceful, our $1,000 a month drainage for storage of the Forceful is no longer needed. So with the volunteers and the guides coming through and visitors numbers are increasing all the time, and continuing to get grants to keep us operational.
Any other questions, comments, observations, memories? Yes.
You mentioned when you were talking about Diamantina that she was towed up from, I presume, Sydney?
She steamed up from Sydney.
Oh, okay. That was my question. Was she towed, or did she
No, she steamed up, and then she met the Forceful in Moreton Bay, and the Forceful followed her up the river. And that was the last time they used the boilers and her steam engines.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. Yes. Anyone?
During the 19th century, were there other dry docks in Queensland?
No. The only other dry docks not in Queensland, but there was 3 in New South Wales. One in the Tweed, one in the Richmond, and one in the Clarence. They were smaller ones. They were operated by, they didn't use a caisson, they used a swinging gate, like the canal docks. And they operated by the New South Wales government. That was mainly to look after the ferries across the rivers before they built all the bridges.
Other questions? Yes.
I walked across the bridge. There's schooling going on with the Japanese. I'm familiar with that TV show.
We've had quite a few TV companies photographed on board the vessels over the years. Not too sure which one it was.
That would have been the celebration of the anniversary of the surrenders,
Oh,
where
right.
we had a grant to hold a reenactment. And we had a reenactment on the stern of the Diamantina, where Australian uniforms, Japanese uniforms, visited, and reenacted the whole thing on the stern of the Diamantina, where on October 1st, 1945, was the final surrender of the Second World War, because all the Japanese garrisons had to surrender individually. So the war actually ended on October 1st, 1945. Because that's the last time the Japanese did end. But can't tell the Americans that.
Ladies and gentlemen,
Thank
my
you.
colleague along today is Michael Savoy. He's the administration manager for the volunteers at the museum. So thanks, Mike.
Other questions, comments, observations?